"Dad, would you like to come live with us in our new apartment?" "Oh, but my son's wife thinks you shouldn't because she thinks you're an outsider." Maybe my husband influenced her. He's always controlled me. Now my son and his wife disrespect me and insult me. They're moving from their old apartment to a new one and suggested we live with them. But they called me an outsider and a bother so openly. I was speechless at how cruel they were. When I heard which condo they were buying, I was confused. Maybe it's best not to live there. Why are you acting dumb? Are you just jealous we're moving to a new place? They mocked me, saying this old house suits me and I should stay here forever. No matter how much I warned them, they never listened. I realized my husband might move out to live with our son, and I accepted it. "If you want to leave this house, I won't stop you." Then 6 months later, my son and his wife came to me in tears, seeking help. I was Grace, a 48-year-old homemaker with an older husband and an adult son. I got married in my early 20s, earlier than most of my friends. At the time of my marriage, I worked in an office at a real estate company. Soon after, I discovered I was pregnant and took a leave of absence. Back then, I was happy to be carrying the child of the man I loved. My husband was thrilled about the pregnancy and very kind to me. He often checked on me to make sure I was feeling okay and urged me to take it easy and not work. Many acquaintances were concerned about us. We had met, married, and had a child in less than a year. But I was too happy every day to let them bother me. Months later, I gave birth to a healthy boy, which marked the beginning of a nightmarish time, though I had no way of knowing it then. The nightmare started shortly after I returned home from the hospital following my son's birth. My husband, who had been considerate, suddenly changed his attitude. "Now that I've been doing the housework, it's your turn to work hard," he said coldly. This change made me annoyed and speechless. He instructed me to have all the housework done before he returned from outings. He stopped helping with chores or caring for our son at all. When I asked why he had changed, all I got back were sarcastic remarks and abuse. "You think it's unfair. Unlike you, I work all day and am tired. That's only natural," he would say. While I understood feeling tired after work on weekdays, I expected him to help out at least on weekends. He showed no interest in our child. If I dared to criticize him for this, he verbally assaulted me. "Stop nagging, and don't you dare criticize just because you stay home, you old hag," he would say. After childbirth, many men reportedly stopped seeing their wives as women. Maybe my husband was one of them. Should I try to be more feminine to win back the kind man he once was? Even though I wanted to, I was too exhausted from housework and taking care of our unfamiliar child to even think about dressing up. Eventually, my husband started staying out overnight more often, even on weekdays. He would come home smelling of women's perfume and sometimes with lipstick on his shirt collar. It seemed likely he was having an affair, but I felt powerless to confront him. I was afraid of being treated even worse if I spoke up about his behavior. Moreover, he began giving us less money for living expenses, nowhere near enough for a family of 3 to live on. Despite my protests, he wouldn't listen. Managing our household on a tight budget became my responsibility. However well I managed, it was never enough. Reluctantly, I put my son in daycare and returned to work, taking extra shifts on weekends when my husband was home to care for our son. As our son grew older and more independent, my husband suddenly started acting like a good father, even though he had previously shown no interest in childcare. It was upsetting that our son was becoming attached to him. What was worse was when our son started imitating his father's abusive language and mocking attitude towards me. Every time I reprimanded our son for his bad language, it seemed to have no effect. Instead, he would retort, "Dad said I don't have to listen to anything you say." Each time our son insulted me, my husband would just smile and pat him on the head, saying, "Good job, just like me." At this point, I thought about taking our son and divorcing my husband. Years passed, and my son became independent. I no longer needed to stay with my husband, but I had learned to ignore his presence and live life on my terms. Still wanted a divorce, but the idea of confronting him and enduring his verbal abuse again seemed like too much trouble. Amidst all this, my husband's company underwent major staff cuts, and he was laid off. Despite being unemployed, he showed no interest in finding new work and spent his days lounging around at home. He continued with his arrogant attitude as if nothing had changed, and I began to feel stressed again. When we were both working, we could avoid seeing each other at home by adjusting our schedules. However, with him always around, that became impossible. It became difficult to live while avoiding him as before, and my stress only increased. Feeling like I might lose my sanity if this continued, I seriously started considering a divorce. Sometime later, my son, who had moved out some time ago, came to visit and shared some joyful news. He wanted to marry his girlfriend, who he had brought along. I was genuinely happy for my son and blessed them. At first glance, the girlfriend seemed like an ordinary woman. However, during the meeting, which was supposed to be joyful, my husband and son continued to insult me as usual. Seeing the discomfort in the girlfriend's eyes, I felt a slight sense of relief. However, after several meetings, her attitude towards me began to sour, likely influenced by what my son had told her. I sighed and gave up on trying to become close with her. Later, my son and his wife registered their marriage and began living together in an apartment he had rented. Since their place wasn't too far from our house, they visited us now and then. After living there for a while, perhaps finding the apartment too small, they decided to move to a newly built condo. When my son and his wife visited our home to discuss their plans, I was surprised to hear the name of the condo they were considering. Before I could recover from my shock, they said something even more surprising. "Dad, won't you live with us in the brand new condo? It would be more comfortable for you." Taken aback by this sudden proposal, I inadvertently interjected, "What? What are you saying?" Then my daughter-in-law coldly glared at me and said, "Can the outsider please not interfere? We're talking to father-in-law here. Outsiders are not allowed." Being openly called an outsider by my daughter-in-law was shocking, and I was left speechless. Meanwhile, my son and his wife continued to encourage my husband to live with them, and he seemed keen on the idea. Watching them happily discuss the new home, I began to recover. Since hearing the name of the condo, I had been concerned, so I decided to speak up. "Irvin Court is a bad neighborhood. Maybe you should reconsider that condo." But no one listened to my advice. "What? Give it a rest. Stop butting in. Are you jealous because we're moving into a new condo? That's pathetic. This shabby house suits you. Live here for the rest of your life," they retorted. Once again, my words were ignored, and I realized this. Finally, I came to terms with it. If my husband wants to move out and live with them, it might be the right opportunity. "Fine, if you also want to leave this house, I won't stop you. But if that's the case, could you please divorce me first?" I suggested to my husband. My husband looked slightly surprised at my suggestion. Soon after, my husband smirked and agreed to the divorce immediately, signing the papers without hesitation. His nonchalant acceptance surprised me more than anything. I realized I should have divorced him sooner while he was still agreeable. I then presented him with property division waiver documents I had prepared in advance through a lawyer. This document essentially agreed not to divide any property during the divorce. My husband, thinking he had more money than me, felt it was advantageous not to divide the property, believing it would be a loss for him. Despite having an easy opportunity to gain money, he disdainfully signed the papers, as if calling me foolish for giving up such an opportunity. I held back my irritation and watched as he signed the document. Thus, our divorce was finalized, and soon after, he moved into the condominium purchased by my son and his wife. 6 months after the divorce, while I was enjoying my carefree single life, I received a call from my son. "Mom, please do something. Dad won't work, and we're struggling," he said desperately. My ex-husband had initially lived off his unemployment benefits and savings, but once those ran out, he completely depended on my son and his wife's income. No matter how much they urged him, he refused to work and only strained their finances. Although I could have predicted this, it was unexpected for my son and his wife. They had apparently planned to receive financial support from my ex-husband, who had always lied about having plenty of money. Believing his lies, they thought living with him would help with their mortgage payments, so they bought a more expensive condo than they could afford on their income alone. Instead of providing any financial support, my ex-husband only depleted their resources. Rushing to ask for my help was the outcome of their poor judgment. Hearing all this, I could only shake my head in disbelief. "That's why I told you that buying a condo was a bad idea. You didn't fully listen to me, did you?" I said. "Indeed, I worked in real estate, so I knew the price of the condo they were planning to buy was not suitable for their income. I had tried to advise against the purchase because I thought they would not be able to afford the payments." Upon learning the truth that his father was not as financially secure as he had believed, my son was at a loss for words. Eventually regaining his composure, he bitterly muttered, "I can't believe Dad had so little money. And to think, Mom, how did you manage to support him with your meager earnings?" Frustrated by my son's misguided comments, I sighed again and said, "I don't know what your father told you." Then I explained my own situation. When my son was younger, I returned to work at the real estate company where I had previously been employed. Realizing there was a limit to increasing my income that way, amidst demanding days of work, household chores, and childcare, I obtained qualifications such as a licensed real estate broker and appraiser. Through gaining experience at the real estate company, I eventually started my own business a few years ago. By that time, I had become accustomed to ignoring my ex-husband, who had completely disregarded me and likely didn't even notice that I had started my own business. My business grew more successfully than anticipated, and within a few years, I was earning substantially more than I did as an employee. That's why I made sure to handle the property division during our divorce. After hearing my story, my son seemed stunned on the other end of the phone. "Well, that's the situation. You should also strive to live independently without relying on others," I told him. After saying this to my silent son, I hung up the phone. A few days later, surprisingly, my ex-husband and my son's family showed up at my workplace. After our divorce, I had moved out of the house we had lived in and had not disclosed my new address to them. Yet somehow, they had found out where I was. Wondering about this, it must have shown on my face because my son said, "I really wanted to see you, Mom, so I searched desperately to find you." It seemed my ex-husband, having heard about my conversation with our son, approached me with a greedy look in his eyes. "I supported you all this time. Give me something in return," he said. I couldn't help but snort at his ridiculous claim. "What are you talking about? You supported me. You never helped around the house, just belittled and ignored me." "Stop joking, please," I retorted. My ex-husband was at a loss for words. Though their visit was honestly a nuisance, it might have been fortuitously timed. Deciding to settle everything once and for all, I stepped out of the room and called a certain man, saying, "I need you to come here right now." While waiting for the person I had called, I managed to keep my ex-husband and his family in the reception room. They sat there slightly perplexed but stayed put, munching away at the snacks on the table. Were they that hard up for food? As I grew incredulous at their lack of decorum, The person I had called arrived. "Sorry to keep you waiting," said the man as he entered the reception room. It was the lawyer who served as the legal advisor for my company and had handled the paperwork during my divorce. Seeing the lawyer suddenly appear, my ex-husband and his family were taken aback. I didn't wait for their confusion to settle and quickly addressed my ex-husband. "I will be claiming property division from you." My ex-husband objected. "What property division? What are you talking about? What did I do?" As expected, my ex-husband objected, but I calmly informed him, "I won't let you forget how you treated me during our marriage." In fact, I had been keeping a record of all his mistreatments, thinking it might come in handy if we ever divorced. This included details of the verbal abuse he had hurled at me, the long hours I had to work because he wouldn't provide enough for living expenses, and evidence of his infidelity. After consulting with my lawyer with this information, I was told it was possible to claim property division, so I proceeded with it. Yet my ex-husband smirked arrogantly, claiming he had no money to pay any property division. To this declaration of unwillingness to pay, the lawyer coldly asked, "Shall we settle this in court then? We have sufficient evidence to claim property division on behalf of the lady. If you refuse, we will proceed with appropriate measures." As soon as he heard the word court, my ex-husband panicked. "Court? No, I didn't really." Eventually, perhaps out of fear of litigation, he'd agreed to pay the property division. Seeing his pitiful state, it seems my son and his wife finally saw him for what he was, desperate for money. "Mom, I'm sorry for everything up until now. We'll take good care of you from now on. Let's get along, okay?" they said, cozying up to me. It was obvious they were acting out of financial interest, and their attitude was displeasing. Even though they were my son and his wife, I decided to firmly push them away as a last act of love. "No matter what you say or do, I will not provide financial support for you in the future. Earn your own money instead of begging from someone else," I sternly told them. Upon hearing my words, my son and his wife looked disheartened and hung their heads. Later, the property division my ex-husband was ordered to pay started being deposited regularly every month. It was a small amount, so it would take time to complete the full payment, but I decided to wait patiently. Meanwhile, my ex-husband apparently started working part-time at a store. However, he seemed to be earning just enough to cover his property division and personal entertainment expenses, still depending on my son and his wife for living expenses. Continually struggling with living expenses and mortgage payments, my son and his wife eventually decided to sell the aforementioned condo because they could no longer afford the mortgage. They asked a real estate agent for an appraisal, but apparently they were not satisfied with the amount and came to me asking, "Can't you buy it at a higher price?" However, the offer amount they showed from other companies was reasonable, and I could not buy it for a higher price, so I brushed off their request. My real estate business is still progressing smoothly, and my personal life is also stress-free now that I no longer have to deal with my ex-husband or my son's family. With the time I once spent on my husband now freed up, I have more time to spend on myself. Maybe I should find a hobby, I thought. With that thought, I am living happily each day,